Always follow the rhizome by rupture, lengthen, prolong, and relay the line of flight. Make it vary until you have produced most abstract and tortuous of lines of n dimensions and broken directions.
Flicker theory with Tadas Vinokur. Flicker theory with Tadas Vinokur.
Hello everyone, Tadas Vinokur here. Welcome to yet another episode of Flicker Theory Reviews. Today's video is going to be a real doozy as I will commence the series of reviews of this monumental, earth-shattering book, A Thousand Plateaus, written by Gilles Deleuze and his collaborator, partner in crime, Felix Guattari. I will refer to them as D and G throughout this review. The main goal of these videos will be to review closely, yet in an accessible, uncluttered way, every chapter or so-called plateau of this book. Most importantly, the sequence of these videos will be left to chance, as the chapters themselves are deliberately written in a non-sequential, non-hierarchical way. D and G themselves said that chapters of this book may be read in any order whatsoever. I will begin out of habit, simply out of habit, with the first chapter called Rhizome, but after that I will take up other chapters or plateaus at random. Every reading of this book should produce an original interpretation. Perhaps after I'm done making these videos, viewers will be able to mix and match, randomize, create their own patchwork quilt of videos as plateaus. As D and G write, a book itself is a little machine. A book is made of variously formed matters and very different dates and speeds. As interpreters, we shouldn't fight this multiplicity of ideas. We shouldn't fight the book as a non-linear assemblage. We should instead embrace it and try to make use of this machine. In other words, we should look for the ways in which, as D and G say, this book will function with other things, concepts, and multiplicities. The ways in which this book can affect our daily lives, for example. This can only be achieved if we dare to participate in D and G's plot, if we deprive ourselves of the need to apprehend the one omnipotent reading of the book. Consequently, these videos should allow every reader to get something new, something unexpected out of A Thousand Plateaus. Thousand Plateaus. Well, let's get right into it. So, who are the people writing this book? Gilles Deleuze, born in 1925, was a philosopher who, before entering this collaboration with Felix Guattari, was famous already for his books on philosophers such as Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Hume, and others. Most importantly, Deleuze was special for his apathy towards the mainstream philosophical traditions, such as existentialism or phenomenology. Deleuze took a different route. He found inspiration in very different authors who, instead of talking about separateness of body and mind, talked about continuity and uniformity of body and mind. However, more on that later. Felix Guattari was a totally different fellow. He was a psychotherapist. He was not a trained philosopher. He gave up his pharmacy studies for political activism and journalism and entered psychoanalytic training under Jacques Lacan. After a short while, Guattari became one of the most important Lacan's students. Ultimately, Guattari abandoned training with Lacan and became a co-director of the radical psychiatric clinic at Laborde. Laborde's constitution imagined the organization, the psychiatric organization, as a communist utopia. In this clinic had no formalized bureaucracy. Staff members were required to rotate in and out of manual labor in order to destabilize the hierarchy. Finally, in the late 60s, Deleuze and Guattari met and decided to write a book together. First, they wrote a book called Anti-Oedipus, which was an instant hit in France. It was a groundbreaking, radical book that foreshadowed the mighty force of this collaboration. I will, throughout this video, allude to Anti-Oedipus to some degree, since a lot of topics that are discussed were first introduced in anti-Oedipus. Before I even begin to talk about the first chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, I should first discuss very quickly the philosophical context of the book. After all, without a good understanding of metaphysics and epistemology involved in this book, we risk rendering this book poetic or philosophically incompetent. Well, let's discuss this very briefly. As I said, Gilles Deleuze took a radical path in his philosophy. He was not impressed by existentialism or phenomenology because these schools of thought for him were overly egocentric. They privileged human subject, his freedom, authenticity perhaps. Phenomenology, for example, privileged the experience of consciousness. It tried to analyze these structures of consciousness. Well, Deleuze didn't want any of that. For him, it was more interesting to find a way to bring the structures of the sensible, that of the body, and intelligible, that of the mind. He wanted to bring these structures together. Hence, Deleuze was always more influenced by such concepts as instinct, taken from Hume and Jung, élan vital, taken from Bergson, and will to power, taken from Nietzsche. For example, when Deleuze was writing on Bergson, he emphasized intuition and immediate experience as more valuable of faculties in understanding the world. These faculties allow us to see the concepts, phenomena with which we interpret the world, and the material substance, the things we touch, as coexistent or immanent. Hence, we should simply remember that according to Deleuze, we shouldn't anchor life in a transcendent principle, an idea. Instead, we should look for purely immanent ideas, which perceive our existence as a fluid entity, which constantly evolves and develops rather than staying fixed to some sort of a Platonic fixed idea. The question that we will try to answer here is the following. How can we think with the world rather than about it? Well, our thought shouldn't seek to define the world, but should instead tread along with it. This way, D&G can create new concepts rather than merely fit things in pre-established forms. Now, finally, we can jump right into the Rhizome, the first chapter or the first plateau, which functions as a kind of a user's guide. Well, since we're talking about plateaus, where did D&G get the idea of the plateau anyway? This concept was taken from Gregory Battison's work in anthropology. D&G described plateau as a continuous, self-vibrating region of intensities, whose development avoids any orientation towards a culmination point or external end. In other words, every plateau is constructed of intensities. Intensities being the way in which continuity of sensible and intelligible is expressed in gradations. So, for example, Rhizome is not just a subterranean root, but also a metaphor or an intensity that synthesizes processes of intelligible and the sensible. Rhizome itself is a perfect way of thinking about continuity rather than discontinuity of thought and matter. Well, so what are they saying in this chapter? First of all, for D&G, there's a certain binarism or bi-univocalization that defines our conventional understanding of the world. For example, in structuralism, signifier and signified may make up the nucleus of signification. Signifier is the way in which people conceptualize something, while the signified is something that is conceptualized, something real. Following Danish linguist himself, D&G believed that this one-to-one relation of signifier and signified is reciprocal, which allows D&G to believe that this book, A Thousand Plateaus, does not try to define the world, but rather reciprocates it. Having in mind that D&G want to write a book that does not reproduce something we already know, they in turn have to dispose of more conventional ways of structuring meaning. The structure that all of us are really used to is symbolized by a tree, they say. A tree. Well, think about a tree then. Logic for example, is put together as a tree. Logic and tree are symbols of a stable hierarchical organization. All lines, whether of descent or ascent, are always clear in logic. Similarly, biology also uses tree-like taxonomy. All organisms are structured in a hierarchical way. For D and G, then this is simply a way to impose structure onto reality that is rather messy. Tree-like structure merely allows us to know what we already know. Consequently, rhizome is the opposite of a tree. Rhizome does not have any hierarchy whatsoever. D and G write there are no points or positions in a rhizome, such as those found in a structure, a tree, or a root. There are only lines. A rhizome may be broken, shattered at a given spot, but it will start up again on one of its old lines or on new lines. That is to say, rhizomes do not unfold in a hierarchical way. They spread by way of underground sterns in which any part may send additional shoots to any direction. There is no hierarchy. D and G talk about ants here. They say you can never get rid of ants because they form an animal rhizome that can rebound time and again after most of it has been destroyed. Rhizome always continues by rupture, lengthening, prolongation, and relay of the line of escape. Rhizome always varies. It evolves and escapes to all directions. Remember, I said that each plateau in this book can be read starting anywhere. And each plateau can be related to any other plateau simply because this whole book is rhizomatic, if you will. It's not hierarchical or linear. Well, surely you say, not all the books in the world are written in a rhizomatic way. Most of the books we read have a sequence of events that are more predictable or even more cliche. To this end, D and G bring up two other book forms, the taproot book and the fascicular root book. Let's first talk about the taproot book. Taproot book is based on author's authority, his privileged position vis-a-vis the world. We know these books because we are used to the sequence of events. This happened to the protagonist, and then this happened to the protagonist, and then this happened to the protagonist. D and G call it the classical book, as I said, a noble signifying and subjective organic interiority. Such a book imitates the world as art imitates nature. Such a book is self-contained. It is perfectly coherent internally and yet also relates to the external world. Binary logic is the spiritual reality of the taproot book. The fascicular root is the second figure of the book. Such roots are multiple rather than single. However, fascicular root has an intimate relationship with the taproot, actually. Our belief that omniscient author can tell us something about the world gradually waned. We tended to dismiss the taproot book. And then people invented fascicular root-based books that are aborted by nature. They lack consistency or logical harmony, but do nonetheless imagine this conceptual unity as something past or yet to come, as something that is still possible. Joyce's books, for example, have multiple roots which shatter the linear unity of the world, only as D and G claim to posit a cyclic unity of the sentence, text, or knowledge. Nietzsche does the same thing by writing his metaphors. Nietzsche questions the linear unity of knowledge only to invoke the cyclic unity of the eternal return. In other words, fascicular root-based books lack consistency or logic of a taproot-based book, but they nonetheless constantly refer to the unity as something that is still possible, something that is potential. These two forms of roots, the fascicular root and the taproot, are presented here so to clarify the rhizome or the rhizomatic book. Rhizome, again, being the type of connection wherein offshoots spring up in a non-hierarchical way. Any rhizomatic element has the potential to connect with any other element. To quote DNG, a rhizome ceaselessly establishes connections among semiotic chains, organizations of power and circumstances relative to the arts, sciences, and social struggles. Again, the offshoots spring up in a non-hierarchical way. Making a rhizome also requires a principle of multiplicity. Multiplicity is a concept that appears quite often in this book and has a lot to do with the concept of the rhizome. By talking about multiplicity, DNG critique the conventional ways of talking about a plurality or a cluster, conceptual cluster. We tend to refer to the many by subsuming it under the one. We look for common traits of, say, musical pieces, and we subsume it under one genre. Such a way of reasoning makes sure that nothing new is created. Whatever changes the many may undergo, the transcendent one, the genre, will still be there. Well, DNG want to make a rhizome out of this. Multiplicity in this case is not a static unity, but something constantly evolving into clusters and amalgamations with other multiplicities. These amalgamations transform into lines of light that connect them outside of themselves and transform them. DNG's favorite example here is the orchid and the wasp. Each of them deterritorializes the coding of the other in order to re-territorialize it for their own sake as part of the reproductive system of the orchid and nutritional system of the wasp. That's a multiplicity which utilizes a line of flight. A line of flight for a wasp and a line of flight for a orchid. Lastly, I will talk a little bit about the dichotomy of mapping and tracing. In DNG's words, what distinguishes the map from the tracing is that it is entirely oriented towards an experimentation in contact with the real. It fosters connections between fields, the removal of blockages on bodies without organs, the maximum opening of bodies without organs onto a plane of consistency. In other words, if we trace the intensities, we simply transfer ready-made pictures onto another surface. The key is to map the surface. By mapping the surface, we can indicate objects' tendencies and potential for change. Here, DNG are very critical of structural models of tracing, such as psychoanalysis or linguistics, because they reproduce something they already know. In summation, DNG say that the issue here is to produce the unconscious, and with it, new statements, different desires. The rhizome is precisely this production of the unconscious. We need to learn how to be, write, and think with a rhizome, not necessarily like a rhizome. Rhizome, say DNG, is composed not of units but of dimensions, or rather directions in motion. It has neither beginning nor end, but always a middle, from which it flows and which it overspills. So let's not put obstacles on our way to new concepts that may rejuvenate our thought. Let's not assume that the stable thought is by extension a good thought. As DNG say, make rhizomes, not roots, never plant, don't sow, grow offshoots, run lines, never plot a point. Have a short-term ideas. Make maps, not photos. Thank you. See you next time.